1 week season.
Hello, friends and Inner Circle fam. I'm your host, StatATL. Back by popular demand this week, I'll be doing my Tuesday first look video on Week 12's 10-game slate, and we'll talk some strategy along the way. So for me, every week I start my process by opening up the DK app, going game by game, position by position, noting my initial thoughts along the way. You can find those pinned in the Inner Circle Discord on the 1 week season page, as well as on 1 week season's Twitter feed later today. So the first game on the DK app is the Chiefs at the Panthers. So on paper, this should be a really good spot for Kareem Hunt, as the Panthers have been gashed by opposing wide receivers. By opposing running backs. And Hunt is averaging 22 touches a game. So the potential news of Isaiah Pacheco's impending activation off IR maybe throws a little bit of a wrench into this. But Hunt is only 5,700, and Pacheco will likely be eased in. Some of the pricing, does seem a little strange this week. Maybe one of the interns was doing the pricing for DK this week. Kind of strange to see Hunt priced down 1,000 from last week in such a strong on-paper matchup. Speaking of strong on-paper matchups, the aerial attack here is very beatable for Kansas City. And at 5,400, DeAndre Hopkins is interesting, as the Panthers have allowed a wide receiver to put up at least 16.2 DK points. So would be a 3x salary score for Hopkins' 5,400 salary this week. In the first 8 games of the year, before holding the Olave and Shaheed-less Saints and Giants under that number the past 2 weeks. So a spot I would consider DeAndre Hopkins here. The matchup, though, however, is really tough across the board for the Panthers, so probably one I'll avoid altogether. The next game on the slate here is the Vikings at the Bears. So initially, I think this is a much better spot than it appears for Justin Jefferson. So while the Bears have been stingy against opposing wide receivers, I think you really need to do a deeper dive into who they've played. The Titans with Will Levis, the Colts with bad Anthony Richardson to start the year, the Rams without Nakua or Kupp, the Panthers, the Jaguars, the Cards, and the Patriots. So their 3 other opponents, the Texans, Commanders, and Packers, are all much more dynamic offenses with better quarterbacks, and each had a wide receiver. So Nico Collins, Terry McLaurin, and Christian Watson all exceed 125 yards receiving. And so Jefferson's also the least expensive he's been all year. So I think this is an interesting spot, one that I think will go pretty much overlooked by the field. Then here on the ground, I don't know that either ground game stands out, as both DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones have seen their respective backups, so like Cam Akers and Roschon Johnson, eating into their workloads. So I'm not sure this is a spot I'm going to target either running back. Through the air, for Chicago, rookie Rome Odunze is probably the most intriguing at 4,800. As his 31% target share last week was the first time a wideout had eclipsed 30% target share this season for the Bears. And the Vikings have already allowed 6 wide receivers to surpass 100 receiving yards against them this season. So I think this is an interesting spot for Odunze. On to the next game, the Titans at the Texans. I think it's great to have Nico Collins back in the fold, but the Titans have been really stingy to opposing wide receivers. So outside of Keon Coleman, who had that 57-yard reception on a broken play, no other pass catcher, so wide receiver or tight end, has exceeded 81 receiving yards against the Titans this year. And it's not like they've played the poo-poo platter. They've faced some elite wide receivers in Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Jaden Reed, and Tyreek Hill already this year. So I would say this probably tempers my excitement around both Nico Collins and Tank Dell at their elevated prices. Despite his robust role this year, The ground matchup is also pretty difficult for Joe Mixon. So again, we're going to exclude one outlier with Jahmyr Gibbs, who broke off a 70-yard touchdown run. No other running back has exceeded 62 rushing yards against the Titans. On the other side of the ball, I think Calvin Ridley here is pretty intriguing. He's seeing a ton of opportunity since the departure of DeAndre Hopkins. He's got 38 targets the past 4 weeks. And he had a 51-yard touchdown called back last week due to an illegal formation penalty. So I think had that stood and he put up another 20-point DK point performance, I think he would be garnering a lot more attention this week. To the next game here, we've got the Lions visiting the Colts. So to me, this stands out as like a really strong spot for Jared Goff, as the Colts have allowed Caleb Williams, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, CJ Stroud, Josh Allen, and Sam Darnold all to pass for at least 280 yards against them. The only quarterbacks they've held in check, so under that 280-yard threshold, was Malik Willis, Tyler Huntley, Aaron Rodgers, and Will Levis. So, Goff is coming off a 412-yard and 4-touchdown game, so his confidence should be high. And he's kind of catching my eye here initially. So several tight ends have also kind of had really strong games against Indy, probably most notably Cole Kmet, who went 10 for 97 and a touchdown, and Jonnu Smith, who went 7 for 96 and a touchdown. And so Sam Laporta would be intriguing at just 4,300 if he were to return from his shoulder injury that kept him out last week. The matchup also probably above average for the Detroit backfield. It's tough for me with Gibbs and Montgomery splitting work to get excited about their workload. Their prices are elevated, and they've each only seen 20 or more touches just twice this season. So you're really making a bet on efficiency if you're paying $7K plus for Jahmyr Gibbs. On the Colts side of the ball, this is an intriguing spot for both Anthony Richardson and Josh Downs. So multiple quarterbacks have thrown for 300 yards against the Lions already, and all 4 quarterbacks who had at least 4 rushing attempts, Mason Rudolph, Sam Darnold, Kyler Murray, and Baker Mayfield, all rushed for at least 29 yards, with half of them putting up a rushing touchdown as well. So I think this is an interesting spot for Richardson. He's still fairly inexpensive and does have that 30-point ceiling. Through the air, the Lions have allowed an opposing wide receiver to eclipse 100 receiving yards in half their games already this year. And Josh Downs has seen 9 or more targets in 2/3 of his games this season. So what I would expect to be a trailing game script for Indy kind of makes Josh Downs my favorite Colt this week. So moving on to the Patriots at the Dolphins. To me, another spot that stands out for Drake May. He's surpassed 18 DK points in 4 of the 5 games where he's played at least half the game. And the 2 opposing quarterbacks that attempted, at least 2 rush attempts against the Dolphins, which were Anthony Richardson and Kyler Murray, they amassed 75 rushing yards between them. So we've kind of seen what Drake May can do on the ground with his legs. So an intriguing spot again for him. In my opinion, in the mid 5Ks. The Dolphins haven't given up any monster games against them this season, but both Kyler Murray and Josh Allen both had 25 plus DK point games against Miami. So I think, I'm going to be interested in May again this week. And, some easy pairing options for him. Both Hunter Henry and Kayshon Boutte have both played over 80% of the offensive snaps in each of the past 6 weeks. And they both remain at 4K or less. On the Miami side of the ball, Devon Achane stands out here again. He's averaging, 19 opportunities a game since the Dolphins' Week 5 bye. And the Patriots have allowed Jordan Mason, Joe Mixon, Tank Bigsby, and Tony Pollard all to rush for over 100 yards against them this season. So, when these teams met back in Week 5, Achane left with a concussion in the first quarter. But even with Tyler Huntley at the helm, Raheem Mostert and Jalen Wright combined for 184 total yards. So to me, this spot stands out for Devon Achane. His price is elevated, but he's seeing really strong work, both 10 to 15 touches on the ground, along with some really strong involvement in the passing game. I think Tyreek Hill is also interesting here, as all of Cooper Kupp, Garrett Wilson, DK Metcalf, Puka Nacua, and Jackson Smith-Njigba all surpassed 100 yards, while other wide receivers like Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs, and Brian Thomas all exceeded 18 DK points against New England. So I think that's a spot to consider Tyreek Hill this week as well. So an interesting game, maybe one I would consider building around. Next game on the slate is the Buccaneers at the Giants. So kind of initial interest here for me. Actually, I think Tyrone Tracy stands out here. I think this is a spot where Tommy DeVito is going to draw ownership at absolute min priced at 4K. But Tampa Bay's allowed games of 100 or more total yards to Kareem Hunt and Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, and Jahmyr Gibbs. And Tyrone Tracy has seen 17 or more touches in 5 out of his 6 games this season. So I think he's a spot that really stands out at kind of that discount pricing for the running back position. Through the air, I think Malik Neighbors is also intriguing, as he's averaging 12 targets a game this season. And the Bucs have allowed 20-plus point fantasy games to 8 pass catchers already this season. So I think that's an interesting spot to consider Malik Neighbors. On the Tampa side of the ball, I think Bucky Irving is interesting here at just 5,300, as the Giants have allowed an opposing running back to exceed 130 total yards in 3 of the past 4 games. And Eckler went for 81 yards and a touchdown on 14 touches in that one outlier game during that span. So a strong spot for Irving here as well. Mike Evans is also expected back for Tampa Bay, but doesn't really stand out to me as no pass catcher, so tight end or tight end or wide receiver, has hit 100 yards against the Giants yet this season. And only Amari Cooper, surpassed 21 DK points. So a 3x salary multiplier score for Evans at his 7K price tag. So again, Amari Cooper, the only one to surpass 21 DK points, and it took 12 targets and 2 touchdowns to do so. So probably not a spot I'm drawn to Evans. So the next game on the slate is the Cowboys at the Commanders. So kind of a spot that initially stands out to me for both Jaden Daniels and Brian Robinson Jr. The Cowboys have surrendered games of 56 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns to Jalen Hurts, 87 yards rushing and a touchdown to Lamar Jackson, and 56 yards rushing and a touchdown to Brock Purdy. So really a spot that stands out to Jaden Daniels for him to be able to utilize, his legs. On the ground, the Cowboys have allowed some massive games to opposing running backs, including games of, kind of total yards and touchdowns of 180 and 4 to Alvin Kamara, 172 and 2 to Derrick Henry, 153 and 3 to Joe Mixon, and 171 and 2 to the combination of Gibbs and Montgomery. So at just 5,600, Brian Robinson really stands out as one of the best values on this slate to me. If we move to the other side of the ball, for the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb just continues to get peppered with targets. He's got 51 targets the past 4 games since Dallas's Week 7 bye. And his price is kind of down to a laughable 7,300. Commanders have already allowed multiple explosive games this year, probably most notable game lines of 10 for 127 and 1 to Malik Neighbors, 6 for 118 and 2 to Jamar Chase, and 9 for 132 to Zay Flowers. So I think CeeDee Lamb, kind of initial interest to me here as well. Moving on to the Broncos at the Raiders. The ground game here stands out for Denver, as J.K. Dobbins, Chuba Hubbard, Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, and Chase Brown all amassed over 110 yards against Vegas already this season. with all but Javonte scoring at least once. However, there's just so much uncertainty on how that workload is going to be distributed in the Denver backfield. It kind of just feels like a spot I'm probably going to avoid unless we get kind of more news. The volume has also been really strong for Cortland Sutton. And while the matchup appears pretty tough on paper, Travis Kelce, Mike Gesicki, and Jonnu Smith all had really strong games against Las Vegas the past 3 weeks, with all of them, putting up, at least 25 DK points. So I think at 5,800, Cortland Sutton's initially interesting. On the Raiders side of the ball, the only interest for me is probably Brock Bowers. He's been absolutely incredible this year. I'm also probably biased as a UGA fan, but he's seen double-digit targets in 4 of his past 6 games, and that includes 16 targets last week. And despite the tough matchup, he produced 23.7 DK points when these teams met back in week 5 when they were in Denver. So a spot for me that I feel like I will probably have some interest in Brock Bowers. Moving on to the 49ers and Packers, kind of that second 4 p.m. Eastern start. So, I'm not sure this is going to be a spot that catches most DFS players' eyes, but San Francisco has allowed 5 wide receivers to put up games of 24 or more DK points, including 2 such instances, 10 for 110 to JSN and 13 for 146 and 2 to CD Lamb the last 3 weeks. So I think to me, the challenge is probably identifying who that might be for the Packers, as Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, and tight end Tucker Kraft all have games of over 19 fantasy points this year. However, only Reed has done it more than once, and he's done it 3 times. So he's probably your best bet. And you're seeing kind of a reduced price on all of the Packers this week. I think Reed is the most expensive pass catcher at 5,900. On the ground, the matchup's pretty middling for Josh Jacobs. Not really a spot that catches my eye initially. But on the other side of the ball, Christian McCaffrey has seen opportunity counts of 20 and 24 in his 2 games since returning from injury this season. And he's completely taken over the San Francisco backfield, with Mason, Garendo, and Kyle Juszczyk only combining for 5 touches in the 2 games since CMC's return. So through 10 games, the Packers have allowed Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, Kyron Williams, Aaron Jones, and Joe Mixon to all surpass 100 total yards against them. So this is a spot that I do really like CMC. Believe it or not, the 49ers are actually last in the NFC West. And despite this being, only being week 12, kind of feels like a must-win game for them. And I would be surprised if McCaffrey doesn't see, 25 opportunities this week. The best value in this game, however, actually is reserved for Jawan Jennings, who, despite back-to-back games of 11 targets and his role greatly expanding since Brandon Ayuk's season-ending injury, is still only 5,600. So again, to me, this is a spot where I'm going to expect him to probably be one of the highest owned wide receivers on the slate. But, we talk about it a lot on OWS. This is probably a good example of good chalk this week for Jennings. So probably one that I'll have in my player pool this week. And then the final matchup of the slate is the Cardinals visiting the Seahawks. Really big game in the NFC West. But the matchup here for Kenneth Walker really stands out to me upon first look. The Cards have allowed James Cook, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Brian Robinson, and Devon Achane, all to account for over 100 yards against them. And all but James Cook also added a touchdown to that metric as well. While Jeremy McNichols and Raheem Mostert also have games with multiple scores against Arizona. So, Walker is averaging over 18 touches a game, and I'd expect him to see a healthy workload here. So he's kind of the piece that stands out to me upon first look. Through the air, Geno Smith is actually leading the league in pass attempts per game, averaging over 37. And Arizona kind of presents an above average matchup there for him. So I think I've got some initial interest in him, as well as DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and the Jigba. They're both averaging over 8.5 targets a game this season. And then on the other side of the ball, matchup really does stand out for James Conner, who's also, averaging 19 opportunities a game this season. And Seattle has allowed Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, James Cook, Bijan Robinson, Isaac Guerrero, Tyrone Tracy, Antonio Gibson, and Ramondre Stevenson all to account for 90 or more yards in games against them this season. And that doesn't include the combination of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, who also totaled 158 yards on 27 touches against them. So a spot that, I do have some interest in James Conner. Pass catchers have also found success against Seattle with at least one player. So George Kittle, Juwan Jennings, Demarcus Robinson, Cooper Kupp, Khalil Shakir, Deebo Samuel, and Darius Slayton all having games of in just their last 6 games. So, pass catchers really finding success against the Seattle team, in the second half, I guess, of the season we've played so far. So Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison, both of initial interest here. And so I would say this game, probably along with the Lions and Colts, is probably one of my favorites to potentially build around. And then if we move to the defensive units that kind of stand out to me here upon first pass, I would say probably the Lions, the Texans, the Vikings, the Bucs in that matchup against DeVito, and then the Denver Broncos. So I would say that probably does it for me here for this week. We've got 10 games on the slate, so 20 teams with, quarterback, running back, 2 wide receiver, tight end, and defense. So kind of 6 viable plays from each team. That'd be 120 total of kind of viable players on this slate as a 10-game slate. So now, as you're thinking through your pool and, looking to make cuts, my advice would be to try to get down to 30 or so guys if you're playing, 100 to 150 lineups. I really like a tight player pool. And so, you just don't want to be one of those guys that, kind of gives, you're playing, 50 guys in your pool. You're playing basically half of the pool. And, when the week ends, you're just, I had all the right guys, just didn't get the right combo. Well, you're basically playing the entire field. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're working through your process. But appreciate you tuning in this week, and I hope to see you and your OWS avatar at the top of the leaderboard here again in week 12. Thanks again.